Welcome to the Financial Executive's Edge. Today's podcast centers around the AI-enabled CFO, covering governance, data integrity, risk oversight, and cybersecurity. I'm Lynn Gargano, your host and moderator with the Financial Executives Networking Group and editor for the Financial Executives Journal. As we all know, AI is transforming finance at unprecedented speed. But with greater intelligence also comes greater responsibility. And in this episode, we explore the evolving role of the CFO in ensuring that AI is deployed responsibly, securely, and strategically. Because in the age of intelligent finance, insight may come from AI, but ultimately the responsibility belongs to the CFO. We're joined today by Shane Reid, CEO of USC Data North America, the business memory for AI readiness and governance, as well as John Hetherington, founder, CEO of We Deliver Your Vision. He's a technology strategist that helps fintech leaders make better decisions faster. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today.
For sure. Glad to be here.
Thanks for having us.
So I think we're going to start at the highest level of this discussion and determine what does really effective AI governance look like within an organization, and in particular within the finance function. So I'm going to toss this out to Shane to kind of get us started.
Well, I was having this conversation with a lot of CFOs and CIOs where we're seeing this in the businesses, and I got to say, I think governance has gone way beyond of just being a policy document in those businesses. It still goes back to, and we're in the data world, right? So I'll come from my aspect. I'll say it's data discipline. I look at it. So when we're having conversations with CFOs, it's like, what are, the ones that are doing it really well can answer a couple of key questions. And that's, where does the data come from? Who owns it? And I think the benchmarking, the most important bit is like, what does wrong look like? If we actually don't know what right looks like and what wrong looks like, then how do we benchmark that? I think without those answers, your governing outputs you can't actually validate. So that's probably where we come from more of an AI governance piece, is actually being able to understand it and being able to put your finger on it if there was something wrong where that went wrong.
Okay. John, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I totally agree with Shane. It's not a policy document, it's a culture. And what we're seeing, talking to CFOs, controllers in the Pacific Northwest, because we just completed a survey of finance leaders, we actually found that only 23% were actively using AI. And a lot of them were just firefighting the day jobs, getting the job done for reporting, board updates, managing their teams. So although they're thinking about AI governance, some of them are not even there yet. So similar to what Shane's saying, is our conversations are really around what data are you using for what decisions, and then how does AI play a part of that?
CFOs who are just kind of beginning this journey, and you've stated it very well, that only 23% were really kind of getting kickstarted in this area. What advice would you give CFOs in evaluating the AI governance structure, or even readiness to even kind of jump into AI adoption? Shane?
So building on what Shane said, it's similar to what is wrong. Like, find out the problems with your data, because we also always talk about garbage in, garbage out, but with AI, it's now garbage in, exponential garbage out. AI doesn't sleep, doesn't get tired, doesn't stop.
24/7, 100 times worse.
Exactly. So it's really now about how do we make sure we're making good decisions better, which really comes down to the process. I know people talk about people, process, technology, but what we find is that without a good process, your best people won't perform. And that's so important in things such as the AP process, the financial close process, just making sure you're getting your basics done well before you start automating and accelerating with AI.
Yeah, and Lynn, we do like, we almost mandate discovery with clients now, because understanding, yes, the people, the process, technology, and to be fair, this day and age, technology will always work. It's just a horrible saying. It's just a question of time and money to make the tech work. But we're talking about a governance framework we're talking about that discovery, like we really, really dial it down and go, let's build a data accountability map. And that's just a fancy way of going, let's follow the bouncy ball of, documenting which systems feed which decisions. So we always understand what has driven that. So, if the governance, I think governance collapses when no one can trace the number back to its source. So if we can build that and then we understand the process. And to be fair, and I'm sure John sees it all the time, is a lot of people are trying to digitize and put AI on a legacy process that was 17 stages. And we go, guys, if we just connected this better and did better things with the data, it would be six areas that we would be managing now, not 17 in there. So absolutely understanding that process and working backwards.
We're seeing a lot of boards just say to CFOs, go do AI. You need to get on the AI train. And to Shane's point, that puts a lot of CFOs and accountants deer in the headlights. Where do we start? So building on what Shane said, it is literally about, okay, what do we have now? What works? What doesn't work? Fix that foundation, which might be just removing some approvals from your process flow to streamline before you start applying new technology.
Or should you be doing it in the first place? Sometimes you go, oh, we need AI. I suppose the first really bad question to ask is why?
Yes.
Like, who is it? Is it helping the client? Is it helping the business? Is it helping the employees? And is it going to help the bottom line? And if you can't measure that and answer that straight up, you're not ready.
As you've both been echoing, so many organizations treat AI adoption as a technology project, which it goes so far beyond that, right? For the human in the loop, the processes, and the people, the employees, the training, and giving them a sandbox, and then there's the cultural buy-in. So there's a lot of aspects that go into AI adoption, and I know you've both focused as well on the criticality of data integrity, because basically AI depends on, right, reliable data, as you said, John, like garbage in, garbage out. So what are the biggest data quality risks that CFOs underestimate?
You want to go first, John? I can. I say I'm the data. Multiple systems and people have bought more over. I think duplication. I think duplication and even definition drift in the business, because you've got the CFO who's, let's just think about it. You've got two departments. They're using the same metric, but they calculate it differently. It's fed from different sources. So finance still calls it revenue. The sales area and the CRO still calls it revenue, but they're off by 15%. So an AI, it will ingest both. Will ingest both data sets, and it learns that wrong pattern. And it's very difficult when we keep feeding it this information to roll back when it's built that. So, and the CFO doesn't know that until they present to the board, and everything goes sideways on that. So I think once we go in, we think about, it's an old acronym, ROT, redundant, obsolete, and trivial data. If we can reduce that out of the business and remove the duplication out of the business, at least we know we've got a clean data set that we can baseline in the business and understand. That's my side. So John's different.
Yeah, and echoing that as well, like I said, mentioned earlier, a bad process automated is still a bad process. So the inconsistencies come from human input. And much as we want to automate and have AI or any automation streamline the process, remove the data quality issues, unless there's a human checking that, then you're still going to have a bad result. And we often see inconsistencies around the data across different entities. Then there's an Excel bridge, which extracts data from your ERP and puts it into a Power BI report. Each one of those transition points is a position of data error. So looking at those transition points, how can we shore up the quality, consistency, and accuracy of that data so your reports are consistent, accurate, and reliable? And then as a result, you're not suffering bad data, which I saw an interesting statistic from IBM around data quality problems costing the US $3.1 trillion. And that's not AI related. That's just bad data, finding the data, fixing the data, correcting mistakes. 3.1 trillion. So anything we can do to help that is going to help the bottom line.
Yeah, and literally on average, the businesses where we go in and we do a data cleanup, at best 25 to 30% of the data is actually usable. It's the real data set. so we're talking at least 70% of the data that exists in any business that you go into could be just removed from the entire scenario of a business. And that goes back to cost as well. Think about storage and management and security all around that additional data. You do not need to have it. And that's what
No,
we're trying to
absolutely.
pull
I know
out.
from my experience as a CFO and overseeing automation projects, so much time was spent on data scrubbing, right? To see one version of the truth, a consistent data dictionary, right? Understanding the embedded assumptions and reporting. So that resonates well, and that's a critical part. So maybe you gentlemen could potentially give some examples of the consequences of having bad data when you overlook these risks. So flawed data going in, have you had clients or worked on projects where you've seen the consequence or the outcome of that?
Yes, for sure. So we work a lot with medium-sized businesses, 50 to 500 people in the 50 to $100 million range. So these folks are starting with AI. They're starting to get used to AI. They're dipping their toes in the water. And what we found is the first bit is just a chat, just a search, just to understand how you can use AI. But that very quickly jumps into okay, let's produce a report to the client on billing, for example, or a status on the stage of the financial reports. So the AI, once we know that problem to solve, the AI is then searching a specific directory or folder for the information. To your point around data quality, it's not only the data quality within that folder, it's also the data available within that folder. So we found during testing, and this is why testing is so important, is that when we were running the queries to produce the client update report, it was only looking in one folder. All the other client information was stored across many folders all over the place. So pulling all that data together can be a bigger exercise than the actual project itself. So it's not necessarily just about the quality, it's making sure the AI has access to the right data to pull out the right information to create the right
disparate
result.
data,
In this
big
case, was a
problem,
client report.
especially in larger organizations, right?
Yep.
Well, we've got to have context, right? So and that's our biggest job when we're going in with our clients is, to John's point about that unstructured data that's hiding in all of these folders is we try and change their minds again. We need to remove the folder structure. So we actually contextually now add structured and unstructured data together, and we're labeling and doing data classification. So we're like, okay, give me all of the invoices to make decisions for an AR or an AP, and when people do it wrong, get to your point about what have we seen go bad? I mean, we've seen people make vendor decisions and headcount decisions and pricing decisions based on AI outputs that weren't necessarily checked or benchmarked. That's when because underlying data was bad, and AI isn't always wrong. I know everyone knows the term hallucination, but that goes back to there's 17 copies on average of data in a business, and it goes, I'm just going to take number 6. And I go, well, number 6 is from 3 years ago, and it related to another project that shouldn't be in this baseline, and that's when we go back to
absolutely.
context.
So you start with your
With
AI
data.
governance and you stress test for AI readiness to say and understand why you want to adopt AI, at an enterprise level and particularly in the finance function. You make sure you have integral data, right? Consistent, non-disparate data, usable data, and then you have to think about integrating all this information into your financial systems. And ultimately, there's going to be aspects of sensitive data and security concerns whenever you're implementing new AI tools, right? So, and it becomes more and more complex, as you bring data sets together. So, what do you see as new vulnerabilities emerge when integrating AI tools? What is the biggest risk?
So my advice for anyone, not just CFOs, anyone adopting AI is treat AI like an intern, like a new hire, someone new to your business, new to the company. Because like someone new to the company, you wouldn't give them access to every single system. You wouldn't give them access to all the sensitive data. You give them an initial set of work to do so they can work on it, prove themselves out, check for mistakes, and then they build competence. And that's the same for AI. So when we're training AI on the models or the task or this procedure that they want it to complete, it will make mistakes. But that's when you test it out, train it, give it more information. Because at the end of the day, the security is all about how you work with that intern or that AI to prompt it in the right way, to guide it, to help it make better decisions.
Shane, what have you seen? Have you seen kind of this kind of go astray or gone wrong where there's a data breach
Good
when
point.
trying to use AI tools?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point on the intern analogy, but I mean, more get back to the data point. We're seeing, we're back to where we're seeing data sprawl, right? So teams start using the AI tools, even approved ones, right? But they start moving data, so they're exporting to CSVs, they're pasting into prompts, they're connecting third-party apps, and suddenly sensitive financial data that they think, oh, it's a private data model, we're cool. But it's now sitting in 5 places that it was never meant to, in there again. So that attack surface expands, and nothing's malicious. No one did anything deliberate, but, no one's necessarily making, deliberate decisions to expand it, but it is naturally occurring again across the business. We're finding sensitive data. So when we do like our PII or sensitive data scans, we are picking up things on local drives and you're down in your downloads folders because they've pulled something down, and we're like, it's back to being unmanaged.
And that initial protection is so important. We're doing a lot of experimentation with Claude Cowork, where it runs agents 24/7 for you. And there's a lot of hype right now around how amazing it is and how it's going to revolutionize work. But it has to start with that security model, that constriction of what data are you allowing it access to, because it will do anything and everything. So you want to be very careful in terms of test it out on 1 or 2 folders of some sample data, but kept within your environment, ideally on a separate machine that's not linked to your network or your own personal device. Then you can test it out and start to build the confidence about how it's delivering results, checking the results, and ultimately with anything we've talked about today, having one person accountable for that result.
I think that's what's missing too, John. You see it in there, you go in there and you start talking to the client. There's a lot of people responsible for certain areas of the process, but no one is accountable. I mean, luckily I'm seeing really good CFOs being accountable for it, rather than, blaming Johnny Ponytail in IT, who's just trying to keep people out of the systems, but all of a sudden he's to blame for the quality and where it goes wrong.
I used to be Johnny Ponytail, by the way, in my younger days when I had longer hair.
Don't worry, so was I. I was in my 20s.
Yeah, it all loops back to governance, right? And part of governance is accountability and making sure that infrastructure in place, because at the end of the day, yes, the ultimate responsibility is with the CFO, but there has to be accountability throughout the organization. Everyone owns an effective governance strategy. Now, we talked about kind of security and sensitive data, right? Assessing that internally, but let's think about external parties like vendors, right? So how should CFOs approach this vendor risk? And especially in the age of adopting AI platforms, whether it's your existing vendor who may say they have, a whole new upgrade in AI, right? And they could be maybe rolling out 2 and 3 upgrades a day, or maybe you're using certain tools that may become obsolete and may be replaced by another vendor. So can you provide some experience of what you've seen kind of in navigating your clients through the vendor assessment?
Yeah, well, I'm going to take it back to where this is where I think you take a step back in the CFO. We're going to go back to the legal and procurement level as well. The amount of clients I'm working with, and I go, let's have a look at the contracts. And the contracts are so out of date that, you're not having vendor contracts now answering the question, which all of them need to be able to answer, is where is my data stored? Is it used to train your model? And who can see it in the organization? Because we forget that so much, nearly everything in the business, whether it's cloud or like everyone's doing the same thing. Everyone's building their models based on client data and everything, and whether or not they should or shouldn't be. Now, I think most vendors have the answers, but I still see that most buyers are not asking those questions of the vendors. And it's very, very important, because if you go back to cyber insurance and all the issue around there is like, who's really holding the cards at the end of the day if client data or citizen data goes missing? Was it the vendor? Was it the organization? So I think that baseline needs to be done, and everyone sort of understand, where is the data, and what are they using it for.
Yeah, and I would ask any vendor 3 key questions. So the first one is, where does my data go? So where is it being stored? Who has access to it, both internally in our organization, but also in your vendor organization? And the key one is, it's not necessarily about the vendor, but the vendor's vendor. Because typically a lot of AI models these days are built on third-party large language models. Not a huge amount of people are actually building their own AI. They're borrowing models. So by inference, you're giving your data to a vendor who's then giving it to another vendor. So that chain has to be understood and secured. So what we've done is actually created a scale of everything from free ChatGPT, public Gemini, which is very unsecure. That's public, that's internet, all the way up to your open claw and your custom large language models. So generally with enterprise, if you're focusing on the Copilot enterprise with Microsoft or your Gemini's enterprise workspace, it's contained in your tenant, your environment. And that's generally, with the right controls, generally the most secure place to put it. So we actually have a scale of this, which we can share with your listeners if they wanted to comment framework in the chat for this, or comment framework on my LinkedIn profile. I'll send them that scale for free, no sign up, and they can see where they land on that scale of privacy and security for AI.
And just beyond the whole data protection, there's the broader risk, right, of cybersecurity, right? You can't escape that, and we're hearing more and more about that risk. So from your perspective, how do you think AI both increases or mitigates cybersecurity risk? Because there's 2 sides of it, right? There's pros and cons to it. And maybe we'll kick this to Shane first, and then John, would love to get your thoughts.
Well, I think it's always a 2-horse race, right? And we use an American, been living here now 3 years, so I'll use the American sort of football. Now, I think there's an offense and a defense team on both sides of this. So, AI is it's a threat multiplier on both sides of the fence. So, on the offense, the attackers are using AI to craft, more convincing phishing exercises and more targeted fraud and, faster exploit discovery. And then on the defense side, AI it's generally really, really good at, and has been for years, for anomaly detection. So flagging unusual access patterns or transactions, behaviors that a human would miss traditionally. So I think let's go back to the CFO's job. I think it's just to make sure and convince the board and the business that the defensive investment is keeping up pace with the offensive threat, and very often go on the businesses. And thankfully now budgets are starting to invest in this, but they weren't necessarily prioritizing that even a couple of years ago. So that's what I'm sort of saying.
Yeah. And even just some of the basics, which seem obvious, but most people don't do it, around the 2-factor authentication for when you're signing in to your ChatGPT or your Copilot, or just making sure you have those 2-factor security levels of a code, authenticator code, or a thumbprint, face print, just to give that extra level of security. And then in the AI environment that you've built is having someone, or ideally with a backup, who can ultimately pull the kill switch. So if you find that something's going wrong, maybe it might just be the AI is starting to hallucinate and go off in the wrong direction too fast, too quickly, and you need to shut things down quickly. You need that one person with a backup who has that kill switch to just stop, say, let's reset, let's understand what's happening. So it's that protect, detect, and then more importantly, react. Most of the disaster recovery, business continuity plans we talk about in business when something bad is happening is not so much the detection, you find out pretty quickly it's happening, it's how do you react? What's your playbook for making sure you can respond quickly, tell the right people what's going on, and ultimately fix it?
Until you can't, John. Until it's self-aware and Hal tells you, John, I can't do this.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, great point.
Are there any cyber threats specifically that target finance kind of AI systems that a CFO should be aware of? Since a lot of sensitive data tends to reside in the accounting finance function.
John, I don't know, you've been watching the media lately, but there's been some doozies that have being done. Like even like let's go back to sort of the co-pilots of the world. I think this is where this is being ignored. And you watch the McKinsey issue that occurred a few days ago. So I wrote about that. It's prompt injection.
Yep.
So a model, basically people were getting in there and poisoning the models themselves. So this is bad actors, manipulating data into a training pipeline, that they'll skew outputs. And prompt injection is basically when someone's getting in there and they craft an input, it tricks the AI system into leaking data or bypassing controls. So think about it, you get on the inside and you go, yeah, we've got private data models and it's our own LLMs and stuff. Okay, but if someone gets in there and they can access all of the training data that's been put into that through prompting, that's pretty bad. You're bypassing controls, and this isn't theoretical. Like this happened. Microsoft had this in the last couple of months where Copilot had been done, and businesses' financial data was being pulled back out of the system through that engineering. So I think finance is a very, very high value target. And AI systems, they kind of need to be treated like infrastructure and, not just software tools. Now, I think maybe we're getting our heads around that.
Yeah, the financial information is definitely very valuable. What we're seeing, it's more around the personal information, particularly medical information, where you have name, address, history, because they're then using that to spoof the call centers, the emails, spam filters. So it really comes back to having very good protection around phishing emails where they're clicking on the link. So training your teams with regular phishing tests where you create a spoof fish email with a link to click, and they're getting very, very sophisticated. That's what AI is doing now, is creating volume of attack because it never sleeps, keeps going, but also the sophistication around how to personalize emails to individual people. Before it used to be one person sending out 5,000 emails. Now it's one AI sending out 5,000 different emails to different people. So it knows what you've done. It knows some of your history. It's gone in your social media profiles. It's then triggering some events in the email, which might think, oh, I wanted a discount on that clothing store I just visited, or with the company, we're now doing discounts for clothing through the merchandise. And it gets very, very sophisticated. So just having those phishing tests to help people spot the email, the first thing to look for is the email address. Where did that come from? Because they'll often have a weird email with one or two different typos. So instead of Microsoft, it might be Microsift. And you're just looking for those little bits of anomalies that'll help you protect against get them sharing your username, password, and everything else with the attackers.
And you see it. I mean, I think still business email compromise is still one of the biggest items still exist, especially in the finance space. I mean, you've seen examples now, Lynn, where there's been, people have been, the CFOs, and this is a famous one from last year, CFO was in a Teams meeting, video had been cloned, the audio had been cloned, the language had been cloned because they had four or 5 months of data that they had been sitting there collecting. So they've done a transfer, thinking they were in a meeting where the executives effectively sign off. The bad actors knew exactly what the delegation authority was. They transferred $250,000 out of the business, and then talking about it in a meeting later, and they're like, "What are you talking about? This meeting didn't exist. The 3 other people on the call were all spoofs." Yep. It's very scary. So we tell our clients now to do things like, and this is definitely in wealth management, especially in wealth management, very, very high target financial services world, is if you're being asked to do something over the phone by a client, train them to SMS something onto yourself, at the same time, only something that you would know, and then basically read the number back to me, so it's just adding that 2-factor even in now. And I know that's scary to say that we can't even trust each other on a phone call or a video call these days, but that's an extra layer that you probably should be bringing in at a governance level when we're talking about items that could be very, very detrimental to the business, whether it was a wrong decision.
Yeah, and even on a personal level, just having a safe word with your family. So if you're worried about your elderly parents being spoofed or your kids being spoofed, when you get that call, is having that safe word or the known word that only you would know is very, very helpful, because then when you say blancmange, it's them as opposed to someone calling asking for money over the phone.
No,
Brisket, John,
absolutely.
down here in Dallas. Brisket.
No,
Brisket's the safe
absolutely,
word.
Shane, and I'm
I don't know
already
why I
seeing
picked Blue
that,
Orange.
just, from a personal experience level, when you call different service departments and it's dealing with sensitive information, they do send you a text with a code and ask you to read it back. So I'm already seeing institutions, and especially service institutions, start to adopt
Yes.
that to kind of offset fraud or any other,
I think that delegation authority needs to be brought into businesses now. Small businesses. I mean, a big business, it's actually even worse for a small business. A big business can probably cope with a $200,000 loss, right? A small business, even getting rid of 20 or 30 grand through a transaction, that is going to cause some significant issues for that business. I mean, that could be resulting in a person being dropped from a business, So I think safeguards need to be, brought in at whatever level business you are. And I think, treating that like two-factor authentication, multi-factor
absolutely. We
authentication.
could have all the technology in place, but we got to
It's
loop
a
back
mandate
into,
in
right,
the
that
business.
governance structure and training for employees, right? You have to take it to the next level as kind of AI creates more complex, kind of insidious environments for bad actors to kind of play in the sandbox.
Yeah, I mean, you see
and
businesses
we know
single source I'm seeing go missing as well. I mean, there's been big stories in the last few days where businesses have effectively had delegation all the way down until it got right to the top of the pyramid. And I mean, I don't know if you read Striker, but it was like a single system basically being able to go out and erase tens of thousands of devices in one click. And they're down. And again, because there was a single layer right at the top of that, even with all the controls they had in place.
Yeah, the biggest risk we're seeing right now is scaling and growth. Back to the points where we started this discussion around why you're using AI, typically because good, healthy businesses now are scaling, they're growing, they're getting busier. So they're focusing on get the delivery out the door, the report, the financial close, the board reports, financial statements. But you also need to scale out the governance, the standard practices, the business process behind it to meet the level of business you're working towards. So exactly to Shane's point, they're growing, but then suddenly their systems are not catching up. So you have a vulnerability, a very simple system behind a very complicated business process, and that's your weak link for security.
And this is not all doom and gloom. Remember, it'll say it's doom and gloom, but AI can do some pretty cool stuff, and it is helping businesses. If you're taking the staff on the journey with you while what you're doing, and they understand the why and don't think that they're all about to lose their jobs, it's pretty cool. Like, you see some cool stuff going on in the business, especially in the finance world.
No, absolutely. And we're here to have a transparent discussion, right? Not just to discuss the good, but, kind of some of the cons, and make sure, you keep looping back into that governance structure, right? There's risks that lurk everywhere, especially as you become more automated and digital environments. So you have to look at both sides. And, the risks just don't stop at the finance function or the CFO. They quickly also elevate to a board level. And I know, John, early in our discussion, you say, there are boards out there that say, let's get AI, adoption in place, right? So how should CFOs be communicating AI risk and governance to the board?
This is interesting. It's a difficult conversation to have because it does depend on your board. Some boards are very open to the risk. So it does come down to where is your company in that risk profile? Because clearly a financial services company dealing with personal banking account is going to have much more risk averse than perhaps a manufacturing company who has to get product out the door quicker. Every company has its own risk profile. So that will come down from the board to say, here's our risk profile for the company. And as a CFO, you can align to that. You can say, based on our risk profile for the company, which is high, therefore we need to prevent the exposure to those risks. So the typical risk cost might be $4 million. We're going to invest 200,000 on this AI protection, cybersecurity, which mitigates a potential risk of $4 million. So we're putting it in financial terms. And again, always comes down to what's that level of risk tolerance for the business, because that will ultimately dictate the level of spend which the CFO is responsible for.
Absolutely. So So before we wrap up today, we talked about AI governance, data integrity, the risks that kind of are lurking everywhere from data protection to cybersecurity and to informing the board, right, of the full landscape and dynamics of AI adoption. So this raises a very important question, and it's a leadership question. If AI increases speed and complexity, what principles must remain constant in financial leadership? Final thoughts, John?
Judgment. So we're seeing a big shift in not just CFOs, all leaders, because the experience you built up as a CFO for the last 20, 30 years can now be summarized for $20 a month in a chatbot. So it's creating a shift to say, as CFOs, where's the value I add to the business in addition to my expertise and experience, which a lot of people can get access to. So it comes back to that one word, judgment. What decisions are we making? Why are we making those decisions? And how do we make the best decisions for the business based on the risk profile and what we want to achieve for our business goals? That's what I would say, judgment.
I'd be very similar sentiment. I think accountability and explainability for everything going on. So every AI-driven financial decision still needs a human who owns it and can explain it. And I know speed is a competitive advantage, but until something goes wrong, right? So then auditability is everything. Right? So the CFOs who will lead this era are the ones who demand that AI makes their teams more accountable, not less in what they're doing. So that's what we're seeing. I'm seeing some really good CFOs, surprisingly, who are 6-12 months ahead of this. Like they're really making this a foundation, and they've brought everyone on board. They are accountable in the areas they could, with a blindfold on, know how that decision was made with the tools, because they can trace it back to the system, they can trace it back to the data, the baseline. And it's cool to see.
Yeah, trust.
That's it. You're right. Trust.
Trust, verify.
Yeah, trust. I mean, I think when people trust it, and that's fed up to the board level, when the board can trust the tools are starting to work, and this is not trying to reinvent the wheel in the business, like sprint in a little area, like pick off little bits in the business at a time, and that trust will start like running itself across the business.
Well said, gentlemen. And that brings us to the end of our AI-enabled CFO, Governance, Data Integrity, Risk Oversight, and Cybersecurity podcast. A huge thank you to both you, John, and Shane, for imparting your insights. It's been very thoughtful, and we've covered a lot of ground, and you've provided a lot of great advice to our listeners. It's clear from today's discussion that the AI-enabled CFO is really not simply just adopting new technology. It's ensuring that AI operates within governance, integrity, and as you said, Shane and John, accountability. And while AI can predict outcomes and certainly drive insights, leadership and accountability will always define the CFO role. So if you've enjoyed today's conversation, please be on the lookout for the AI-enabled CFO and Financial Executive Workshop series, where we continue the discussion covering the full financial landscape with practical use cases and candid conversations around the CFO's evolving role in AI adoption. Thank you for joining us, and until next time, stay informed.